Starting with the G7, where President Cyril Ramaphosa believes his interactions with business leaders in Canada will yield some positive results for the country moving forward. He was speaking after his arrival at the G7 summit in Quebec City in Canada last night, after he met with investors in Toronto early in the day. He'll join other African leaders from Rwanda, in Kenya, Senegal and the Seychelles in the outreach segment of the G7 that will focus on the ocean's economy, recognized as a very important growth pole for the country. Now this as tensions remain very high between the United States and other leaders in the exclusive hub over trade disputes, despite handshakes and pats on the backs in front of the cameras. And as G7 and invited leaders gather for today for discussions on climate change, President Trump will depart for a summit in Singapore with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un.
We had a wonderful exchange of views with business leaders, well over 130 leaders, and the occasion was oversold, which shows a great new interest in the affairs of our country and particularly in South Africa. They recognize the new period that we're in, the new dawn, the new era, and they are warming up to South Africa, and particularly in relation to regaining their level of confidence in what is happening in our country, the way we're moving the country forward, the stability that is being engendered in the country, and of course the response of our people as well.
Well, ahead of the G7 Outreach Summit with developing world leaders that gets underway later today, President Cyril Ramaphosa made a very strong pitch to a group of investors out in Toronto yesterday for a recap of the President's first full day in Canada and, of course, to look ahead. Our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Peace, joins us live from the summit in Quebec in Canada. Sherwin, a very good afternoon to you. Look, before we talk about the day ahead, what can you tell us about President Ramaphosa's meeting with the investors yesterday?
Alicia, a man very comfortable in his own skin. This is a businessman, a former businessman, very comfortable in an environment with over, as he mentioned in that clip, 130 business and investment leaders from Canada. A very important first leg of his trip where, as he said in that clip, talking about the new dawn, this new era, he even compared the mood in South Africa to when South Africa heralded in the new democracy in 1994. He also spoke about his meeting just before he left South Africa with the Afrikanerbond in Cape Town, a bastion of apartheid that essentially had pledged to work with his new administration. Of course, I think speaking to this notion that is being felt certainly on the international arena, that there's possibly a race war looming in South Africa, particularly over questions of land expropriation without compensation. Let's listen to what President Ramaphosa said among a variety of things at that business forum yesterday.
A number of you are already invested in South Africa, for which we thank you. And you've stayed with South Africa over the many years, and some of you were about to lose hope and confidence, but we're pleased that you stayed the course and you are still investors in our country. So we really deeply thank you. It is for also that reason that we felt we should come here on our way to Quebec to the G7 meeting. We're meeting also in the midst of a global economy that is showing signs of recovery and improved growth, which is wonderful. However, it also remains vulnerable with the global trade war, which is looming, and a return to protectionism, but also the weakening of multilateral rules-based international trade systems and other multilateral organizations. This, for us, is worrying. South Africa sees Canada as a strategic partner as we navigate through all these difficult and worrying issues that have to be addressed by the world. And hopefully, the G7 meeting will be able to find solutions for some of these very difficult issues.
The President there, I think, referring very specifically to concerns that emanate from the United States President in Washington in terms of trade tariffs, President Donald Trump's America First policy, expressing very clearly South Africa's concern that this could impede the trajectory that we currently find ourselves on, Alicia, in terms of the stability we are now seeing in global economic growth.
Now people are saying, hey, there is an original sin that was committed many years ago. That sin remains unaddressed, it remains unforgiven. We want this to be handled. So the conference in December decided that we do need now to expropriate land without compensation, but in doing so, we must make sure that it does not harm the economy, and two, it does not reduce agricultural production and does not harm food security. Now, that is the decision that was taken. But the other important one is that this decision was taken as one of the mechanisms that the government should use, and not the only mechanism in pursuing the land reform program. So the land reform program will be pursued
without being prompted, essentially, Alicia, President Ramaphosa tackling this issue head on, certainly a conversation point, but of course talking about Section 25 of South Africa's constitution that has for the last 24 years, or certainly less than that, since the adoption of the latest constitution in South Africa, has had this in the legislation already, talking about the land expropriation without compensation as but one mechanism, and when appropriate, that the South African government will then implement that policy.
Now, Sherwin, yesterday we also appeared to see a very cooling off between some of the G7 leaders, particularly on issues of U.S. tariffs that appear to be leading to, of course, that showdown at the summit. Has Washington now been isolated, as some were calling for?
Yes and no. Let's put it this way. I don't think there's agreement on this issue yet. I think when people are in the same room, when they're standing in front of cameras, there's a lot of handshakes and slapping on the back and a great deal of civility. But as you know, leading up to the summit, there was an exchange of words between President Donald Trump and various other leaders, among them the Prime Minister of Canada, the host of this year's G7 summit, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, where he essentially talked about the fact that the G6, essentially excluding Washington in the sense, would be able to sign an agreement without the United States if it wanted to be continue to be isolated on these issues. Of course, there's a great deal of concern that the isolationist policies of the United States are not just on the economic front. They are undermining multilateral fora, multilateral agreements like the JCPOA, essentially the Iran nuclear deal, the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the move of the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And there's a sense here that the United States is not listening to their closest allies. In addition to that, of course, President Trump, before he arrived here, talked about the need to readmit Russia into the G7 and make it the G8 again. But of course, nothing has moved in terms of the reason why Russia was essentially excluded, and that is over the illegal annexation of Crimea in Ukraine. So yes, they're talking nicely. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has proposed a mechanism to be instituted so that disputes between these allies can be dealt with through that mechanism. But we are looking to see what comes out of the G7 communique that will be issued either later today or earlier tomorrow morning. But there's a sense that if there's a lack of agreement between these seven nations, we will not have a communique at the end of the summit.
Very interesting events happening there, Sherwin. We also understand that the leaders are, in fact, this morning engaged in one of the central themes of the summit. Very critical point there, gender equality as well as women's empowerment. What lies ahead there today?
For the very first time at the G7 summit, Alicia, they have what you call a Gender Equality Advisory Council. And among the people on that committee is the Executive Director of UN Women, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. And we had a chat with her yesterday about what some of the issues are that this advisory council at the G7 is grappling with. She talked about the women's agenda, which is broken, that they're coming here really to get G7 impetus in terms of funding for the women's movement. Legislation calls, even if in developed countries, because of course gender-based violence is a universal concern, is to see greater implementation of legislation. She talked about the gender pay gap, which is pervasive, questions of reproductive health rights for women, improved access to girls' education, and she also talked about the motherhood penalty, the fact that women bear this economic burden because, with pregnancy comes being out of work, and in many countries you still do not have mandatory maternity leave that is paid for by one's employer. So a lot to discuss here, and then in addition to that, the outreach segment of this summit, which includes all the developing world leaders, among them President Ramaphosa, the 4 African heads of state that you mentioned earlier. They will be looking at the oceans economy and how the oceans economy can add to the country's GDP and deal with stubbornly high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, as is a conversation that we continue to have in the South African context.
All right. And of course, Shawan, just as a side note, of course, South Africa being elected as a member for the 2-year non-permanent seat, does this add any value to, of course, them being a member of the G7?
Well, we're not a member of the G7. We're one of the invited leaders here. But what this does represent, remember, this is the first time in 8 years that a South African head of state has been invited back to the G7. So what the presidency is talking about today is this notion of a greater deal of goodwill towards South Africa. They point to, South Africa's chairmanship of SADC, South Africa's current chairmanship of BRICS, the election, as you mentioned, for a 2-year non-permanent seat on the Security Council starting on the 1st of January 2019. The invitation to the G7, there's a lot of goodwill towards South Africa. The question we should ask ourselves, Alicia, is how much longer will the goodwill continue before questions are raised about what policies are being implemented and what this new administration is actually doing on the ground. A lot of goodwill right now, but how long will that last?
Shawan, thank you so much for that sound update. That is Shawan Bryce Peace, our US correspondent, is joining us from Canada at the G7 summit.